Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be bringing you the best Necromancer build possible. And now I do have to preface, this build would not have been possible without Macro Bio Boy. Now he released a video a couple days ago explaining how some of the passives in the shadow side of the skill tree are not working with the Shadow Blight key passive. And this is going to make a huge difference in our build and overall is what made this build possible. So a huge shout out to him. Here's the video he posted and please go make sure to watch it and like and subscribe to him. Again, can't thank him enough for this discovery. All right, here, before we jump into the skill tree, I do want to take a second and talk that this build was actually derived from one of my previous builds with just a very few slight changes. And now that means we're only going to be replacing about 4 points in the skill tree and the Paragon board is identical. Now, the main changes come to the build in the aspects, and we're going to touch on that in its own section, but I just did want to preface that real quick. If you want to watch the original build guide, it'll be linked down in the comments below, or if you're already running it, great news for you. It got better, and it only requires some very minimal changes. So let's jump into the skill tree. We're going to be doing a deep dive into everything that we are using. All right, getting started here, we're going to spend our first 2 points into Reap and into Enhanced Reap. Now, we're not going to be using these in any way, just the first 2 points to unlock our next skill tree. Now here we're going to touch on a major point of the build, which is Sever. We're going to go into Sever, into Enhanced, and into Paranormal. Now, of course, we're going to max out Sever as this does a huge amount of damage in this build. Now, this build is a hybrid of proccing Shadow Blight as much as possible and using Sever as our spender. So basically what's going to happen is we're going to be in pretty much an Infinimus setup, proccing Shadow Blight constantly and using Sever to dump all of our essence. And I'll show you guys how that works in the gameplay section. So first you just want to max out Sever, and then we're going to max out Hewed Flesh as well, and then we'll move on to the next category. Now the most important skill in this is going to be Blood Mist over here. Of course, we're going to max out this 5 out of 5 to reduce the cooldown. And then we're going to go into Enhanced and then Ghastly. Now the reason we go into Ghastly is to leave behind a corpse every second, meaning that we're going to generate quite a few corpses while in Blood Mist, and with these corpses we'll be generating other sources of shadow damage, which is going to proc the Shadow Blight key passive even more. Now, as we move down here, of course, we have Corpse Explosion enhanced into Blighted to make it a Darkness skill. Now, again, this is going to help us with that Shadow Blight key passive. It's going to be auto-cast thanks to one of the Caged Hearts we're using, and overall a great source of damage over time. Now, as we move down here into the passives in this tree, we're going to be looking at Grim Harvest, 2 out of 3 here for some just extra generated essence when we consume a corpse. And then 3 out of 3, you deal 9% increased damage for 6 seconds after consuming a corpse. This will be active 100% of the time. As we move down to the next tree, you're going to see we have both curses being used. And we put Decrepify, 1 point to Decrepify, Enhanced, and Abhorrent. And this is to help with our cooldown reduction. Now, Decrepify is actually not going to be on our bar in any way because we are going to be using the Decrepified Caged Heart that's going to cast an aura around us that's going to cast it for us. And we're also going to be using Iron Maiden, which will be on our bar and we have to cast ourselves. And we're using this to take advantage of the aspect that when you have 2 curses on an enemy, they are going to take 40% increased shadow damage. Now that works with our Shadow Blight key passive, which is our main source of damage. And in total, it gives us a ton more damage thanks to this setup. Now, as for the passives here, of course, we have Death's Embrace, basically dealing more damage to enemies close and taking less damage from enemies that are close to us. And then 12% increased damage to cursed enemies. Now, as we move down here, this is where the big change is. As you'll see, we have 0 points in Terror. And that is because Terror is a trap. You know, like I said, Macro Bio Boy did a huge experiment going really, really deep into why Terror doesn't work the way it should. And it's not necessarily that it doesn't work the way it should. It's just you have to jump through so many loopholes to get this to actually activate in the game that it's not worth it. It's only active for a small percentage of the fights. And especially when you're bossing, it is only active when the boss is completely stunned. And that hardly ever happens with this build. The boss will be dead long before it's stunned. And Terror just really, really is not worth it. We'll gain much more usage from switching this build around. So if you were running the old build, make sure to take your points out of Terror. Now with Gloom, we still are maxing the 3 out of 3 because this does work and it works great. It buffs our Shadow Blight key passive along with basically any damage that we're doing. It is overall a great skill. And then of course we have 1 point into Reaper's Pursuit just to get us into the tree. Now for the skill in this part of the tree, we are going to be using Corpse Tendrils into Enhanced and into Plagued to make sure everything is vulnerable. Now with this, we also are not going to be casting this at all because we are using the Caged Heart that casts corpse skills on corpses. So this is another one that is going to be automatically cast for us, which is super, super nice to have. Now we do have 2 points into Necrotic Carapace, and I do want to state This definition of this passive is super literal. If it is not a skill forming the corpse, it does not count. Hewed flesh does not work with this, and so the question is, why are we still putting points into it? And the main reason is we're generating a lot of corpses from our blood mist. And when do we need fortify the most? When our blood mist runs out. And every time our blood mist runs out, we should have a good amount of fortify from necrotic carapace. That is why I still think it is worth it to put points in here. Now, if you were to take points out of this, I would recommend putting them into either Reaper's Pursuit for extra movement speed, or into Crippling Darkness for a chance to stun enemies. I would recommend keeping them here, but if you want to move them, I understand, and that's where I would put them, in one of these two. Now, moving down here, of course, we're going to pick up Bone Storm as our ultimate ability, into Prime Bone Storm, and all the way into Supreme. Now, for passes, we are going to put 3 points into Standalone and 3 points into Memento Mori to buff our sacrifice bonuses. Now, of course, we are going to be using the Shadow Blight key passive, and this is the main aspect of damage for this build. Everything in this build is making sure that we proc this as much and as fast as often. We're going to be using some aspects that even boost the damage of this even higher, and this is what's doing all of the damage in this build. This is going to be feeding into the Barber, which is then going to be multiplying it into huge, insane crits that basically just going to kill everything in the entire game. So with that, let's jump into the gear and aspects. All right, taking a look at the gear and aspects, if you've seen the previous build, this looks pretty much the same, and there are a few slight changes though. Now, in the helmet, we are running the same aspect, the aspect of Explosive Mist, and while it is nice that it triggers corpse explosions, the main reason we're doing this is to reduce the cooldown of our blood mist. With this aspect, and by using a focus in the offhand, we pretty much have a 100% uptime of blood mist, making it impossible for us to die. Next, here in the armor piece, we are going to be using the aspect of Disobedience, basically increasing our armor anytime we deal a form of damage. Overall, this is a great key to survivability, especially when our blood mist wears off for the split second before we can activate it again. Now, the unique in this build is the Howl from Below, and basically it just really helps with our damage from our corpse explosion. Now, corpse explosion is not a crazy part of this build in any way, but this significantly does increase the damage of the build as it makes corpse explosion very powerful. And with the other bonuses we have to our shadow damage, seeing as corpse explosion is now a darkness skill and deals shadow damage, this really helps with the damage. Howl from Below is by far the best unique for this build, as it definitely increases our damage by a lot. Now, basically what it does here is just increase the damage of our corpse explosion, but not only does that, it turns them when they first spawn into a volatile skeleton that then runs, explodes, and then drops the corpse explosion. And now the reason this is so good is not only is it increasing the damage of our corpse explosions, but it's making sure that we get more coverage with them. See, if you're not using this, the corpse explosions just go off around you, meaning that anything that's not within the first couple feet of you isn't getting hit by them. With this, it will actually go seek out enemies to hit them with, making that you get a far better coverage with your corpse explosions, proccing Shadow Blight even more often. Now, in the pants, again, we are using another defensive. Basically, anytime that we use Bone Storm, it's going to give us a barrier equal to 5% of our base life, making us super tanky when we're in our Bone Storm form. Now, in the boots, I did try in here to give us some more movement speed, as Necromancer is incredibly slow. So basically, while unstoppable and for 4 seconds after, you gain 10 to 25% increased movement speed and can move freely through enemies. Now, when is unstoppable? Unstoppable is going to be our blood mist. So basically, anytime we use blood mist, which should be almost the entire time, we're going to be getting a really nice movement speed increase, and for 4 seconds after. So this should pretty much be active the entire time that you're in the dungeon, making these clear times much faster. Next, onto our amulet, we're going to be using the Blighted aspect, which you deal 50 to 120% increased damage for 6 seconds after the Shadow Blight key passive damages enemies 10 times. This is going to be a huge damage increase to the Shadow Blight key passive. And that is the reason it is in the amulet slot, because any aspect in the amulet slot is 50% stronger. Now, out of all the aspects we're using, this is the one you want to have in the amulet slot. If possible, it will dramatically increase the damage that you are doing with this build. Now, in our first ring spot, we have the aspect of Grasping Veins, basically increasing our critical strike damage every time we use corpse tendrils and every time they are damaged by a corpse tendrils, which it's automatically casting, hitting every enemy, dealing insane amounts of damage. Since we are a very high critical chance hit build, this makes it even better. Now, in our final ring slot, we have the aspect of Ultimate Shadow. Now, this is going to make sure that our Bone Storm is doing shadow damage, and this is really going to help proc our Shadow Blight key passive, especially when we are bossing. This will make it so you deal much more damage in the time that your Barber is building up damage inside itself and then going to explode, increasing the massive amount of hit chance you see and overall making it even better. Now with that, let's move on to our weapon, the Aspect of Decay. Each time the Shadow Blight key passive deals damage to enemies, it increases the next Shadow Blight damage within 10 seconds by 25 to 45%, stacking up to 5 times. This is another very, very important aspect, as it is insanely buffing the Shadow Blight key passive, making it do even more damage. Now overall, if you had a two-handed weapon, this is what you'd put on the two-hander, but we only are using a one-handed weapon, so we're still going to put it here anywhere in the ring section. All of the rings and the weapon can be switched around. Since we're not using a two-hander, they don't get any special buffs. Really, you just want to make sure you have the blighted aspect on the amulet. Decay can be really anywhere. Now, once you have this, we are going to be pairing this with a focus, so a wand and a focus for the chance to reduce cooldowns. So with this, we're going to be using Aspect of the Damned. You deal 40 to 50% increased shadow damage to enemies afflicted by both Decrepify and Iron Maiden. Now, thanks to the Cage Heart that we are using, we don't have to cast Decrepify, and since we now have Iron Maiden, we're going to be dealing insane amounts of damage, as the Shadow Blight key passive counts as shadow damage. It is not a darkness skill, but it does do shadow damage, so it works with this aspect. That is going to wrap it up for the legendary aspects, so let's move on to the gems and the hearts that we are using. Now we're going to be using the Sacrilegious, of course, which basically automatically casts a corpse skill anytime we are near a corpse. This is going to be absolutely massive for using our corpse tendrils and corpse explosions, basically meaning we never have to touch them in this build. Then of course we're going to be using the Decrepit Aura to automatically cast Decrepify around us. Now with this heart, you do want to get one that is at least 0 to 1 enemies to be active, meaning that you have it at all times. And then of course we are using the Barber. The Barber is by far the best heart for this build, even with the buffs to the other hearts in patch 1.1.1. I've tested them, the Barber just outshines all of them. It is incredibly strong. Basically, it's going to absorb your damage and then multiply in itself until it explodes in a massive critical hit. Now for armor, we are going to be using the Ruby for maximum life, and for the weapon, we're going to be using our Emerald for critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies. Now here you can see the skills that are actually going to be on your bar. Blood Mist, which we should always be using. The same with Bone Storm off cooldown. And then Iron Maiden should be used before you go into Blood Mist on any enemy around you. Sever is going to be when you group a huge pack of elites up and need to burn them fast. And then of course we have Corpse Tendrils and Corpse Explosion, which we're going to cast on themselves. Now we can take a quick look here at the board right here for our book. We're going to be sacrificing our Skeletal Warriors into Reaper form. We're going to be sacrificing our mages in the Cold Mages, and we are going to be sacrificing the Iron Golem. Now here you can see the gear stats for every piece of gear. We're not going to go through this, but here they are, and they will be in the build guide if you also just hover over them. Now let's take a quick look at the Paragon board. All right, here we are on the Paragon board, and we are going to be using the Territorial Glyph in the starting board. Then moving up into the next board, we're going to be going up to the Wither board, where we definitely will be grabbing this legendary node, as it was just buffed in patch 1.1.1. And we're going to be pairing that with the Darkness Glyph. Now we move over to the right to the Flesh Eater board, where we also grab the legendary node, dealing insane amounts of damage once you consume corpses, and pairing that with the Essence Glyph. Now we're going to be moving right again into the Scent of Death board, where we're going to be grabbing that legendary node compared with the Control Glyph. Now again, we're moving right all the way up to grab the Amplify Glyph. Now don't worry about the legendary node. We are just using this to grab the Amplify Glyph really quickly. That is the Paragon board. I'm not going to dive in it too deeply, as that would take a very, very long time. This is the same Paragon board that's been used in the past 2 of my builds. It is a super, super strong Paragon board. It pretty much can't be optimized anymore, and I am super, super happy with this board. Now that is going to wrap up the build guide for this build. I hope everyone enjoys it, and I am insanely happy with this build. It does absolute insane amounts of damage, and you can clear easily 20 to 30 level higher than you in Nightmare Dungeon. Now right now, I was testing this on my level 80 to 81 Necromancer, and I've been able to clear all the way up to level 50 Nightmare Dungeons with no problem. Now, overall, I wouldn't recommend you actually doing that unless you're just farming, experience for your glyphs, because you actually don't get any more experience for the higher levels. It just takes you longer. You should only really be farming about 10 levels higher than your character level in Nightmare Dungeons to get the most amount of XP per time. Now, with that though, if you do like to push yourself, go ahead, push as high as you can. I pushed this build just to test, see what it could do. And again, it was able to do those 20 to 30 levels higher, a super, super strong build. Now, I am going to be taking this build up against Uber Lilith at level 85, and I think I can give Uber Lilith a run for her money at level 85, which would be absolutely crazy. Now, that's going to take some tweaks to this build a little bit to focus just on raw bossing, and I think there's going to be a guide coming out for that pretty soon, so stay tuned for that. If you enjoyed, make sure to like and subscribe. Thank you guys, and I hope to see you guys in a future video.